Well, thanks very much for inviting us to speak. It's a real pleasure. What we're going to focus on is children and animals, and I can see from the audience already there's people I know that we work with collaboratively, which is wonderful. So we're going to focus on cruelty and compassion, talk a little bit about how you can promote positive relationships between children and animals, focusing a lot on pets actually. I'm going to cover quite a kind of an overview, and then we'll have time for questions. Then Laura's going to focus on her research on animal cruelty amongst children. And then Gilly's going to round up with an overview of the Scottish SPCA education programme. And a lot of the work I'm going to be talking about has been done collaboratively with the Scottish SPCA and other organisations. So just to say a little bit about our research in Edinburgh University, we focus on three main things. One is looking at children's relationships and interactions with animals, and focusing on the impact that has on children's development and their health, but also how that can relate to animal welfare as well. And then another strand of work is looking at animal assisted interventions for children and young people. For example, we do work on reading with dogs. We're also looking at canine interventions for student stress. And we're looking at interventions, for example, for children who have special needs like autism or ADHD. And then finally, of relevance specifically to today, we're really interested in psychological predictors of cruelty and how you can prevent cruelty by working with children. So we started off this research way back in 2009 actually, and we found there wasn't very much research on children and animals, surprisingly enough. And one of the first things we did was try to find out in the UK how many children have pets. And we found that 70% of children have pets. So it's a really normal, common part of childhood is to grow up with pets, and yet it's very under-researched. Children talk about pets as being part of the family, and especially dogs and other animals that live for a long time. Children often grow up with these animals, so they're really developmentally important. Plus, children are a key motivator to buy pets. So when you think about why families have pets, when there are children involved, it's often because the children have asked for them. They play a key role in animal welfare, firstly by having caring roles. So for example, looking after pets, cleaning out animals, but these roles tend to be very gendered, we found when we've done qualitative research, and Janine Muldoon, my colleague, has led on a lot of this. And there are also barriers to children taking caring roles because there are concerns about safety when it's cleaning out animals or walking dogs. You know, parents have to judge quite carefully what's safe for children to do for the child and the animal. And so these relationships are often reciprocal, but they can be balanced or imbalanced. So you can have reciprocal benefits where the child and the animal benefit. You can have reciprocal costs where the animal's welfare is compromised and the child's health is compromised. So for example, if the child's handling of an animal is so rough that the animal becomes fearful, then the risk is high that that animal might bite the child. So that would be a reciprocal cost kind of situation. And you have imbalanced interactions like this picture of this little girl. She's obviously having a lovely time. She's enjoying handling the rabbit, but she's not handling the rabbit safely. So the chances are that the rabbit may become distressed, so that its welfare is being compromised. When we're thinking about compassion and cruelty, we really wanted to highlight that they're not inversely related. So kind of high compassion does not always mean sort of kind of positive behavior towards animals, because you can accidentally harm an animal while you're trying to be kind and compassionate by feeding the wrong food, by overfeeding, by handling roughly when you're trying to be caring. So the idea that compassion and cruelty are inversely related is a bit too simplistic. And equally, you can have a child who's quite low on empathy or low on compassion, and that does not mean to say they will deliberately harm an animal. In fact, they may choose not to engage with animals and not to have pets. So in our work, we're trying to be very mindful of the fact that this relationship between compassion and cruelty is complicated. Some of the psychological risk factors we've looked at and protective factors include things like animal welfare knowledge. The greater the knowledge, the more compassionate the behaviour is likely to be. strong attachment to pets, a belief that animals have mind, and attitudes that cruelty are wrong are all protective, and I'll say a little bit more about them. And then we have psychological risk factors such as the kind of adverse childhood experiences, certain demographic variables, low empathy, high callous unemotional traits, psychopathy. These kinds of psychological variables can pose risk factors for animals. So focusing on positives first, attachment to pets we found is a really important protective factor towards animals. It tends to be associated with a very strong emotional bond, synchrony, so caring behaviour that's attuned to the animal, and the animal forms a kind of a safe base and gives comfort to children. And it can also be reversed as well, so animals can become very attached to humans, especially dogs. We're kind of very interested in attachment among dogs at the moment. Sorry, I'll move back. In our research, we found that high attachment to pets is linked with positive mental health outcomes for children and young people and higher quality of life. It does vary with pet type, so it tends to be higher with dogs than with cats, for example. It's also higher with small animals where there's a really kind of interactive caring role. We found that attachment to pets decreases in adolescence, which is a concern because deliberate cruelty seems to increase at this time. And it's also gendered, where girls will admit to being attached to pets more than boys. It's linked with attitudes and behaviour as well, which is important. And it must be very important at the moment, because in times of stress or when children are very vulnerable, for example, when their human relationships have broken down, attachment to pets can be really vital. It can be one of the main attachment sources they have. And at the moment, when we're all going through COVID and families are quite stressed, my suspicion is that attachment to pets is going to be particularly important for some children just now. And importantly, we've shown that you can improve attachment through intervention. So it's something that animal welfare organisations can have in mind when they're developing their interventions. Belief in animal minds and an understanding of welfare and needs is really important too. And we know from our research that children generally have a low level of knowledge about animal welfare needs. It's very complex. The welfare needs are multiple for each type of animal, and even within a specific type of animal, say a dog, different breeds will have slightly different needs. So it's not surprising that children, especially young children, have quite low welfare knowledge, especially with animals that they're not that familiar with, such as farm animals. So what we focused on, as well as welfare knowledge, we've gone to a more basic level of understanding, where we've looked at children's understanding of animal minds. And that's simply a belief that animals have thoughts and feelings, that they're capable of feeling happiness and pain, and that they have cognitive abilities. And this, we developed a measure called the Child Belief in Animal Minds, and we've done a series of studies and found that this belief increases as children go through primary school. It varies with different types of animals. So they rank dogs as having more cognitive abilities and more emotional abilities than chimpanzees even. And that it's cross-national. So we've done research not just in the UK, but in Spain. And again, importantly, you can change children's belief in animal mind through educational intervention. The third area that I want to focus on in terms of the positives that we can be doing in educational interventions and in the home is think about children's attitudes towards animals. Generally, children have a really positive attitude towards animals. So it's, changing their attitude to become more positive probably isn't going to have that much impact in terms of educational outcomes. But if you're very specific in what attitude you're focusing on, you can make a big difference. So we've developed work around children's attitudes towards cruelty itself. And we've developed another questionnaire-based measure that can be used with primary school children. And we found that the children who have attitudes that cruelty is acceptable are more likely to be less attached to pets and also to show less humane behaviour towards animals. So by changing this attitude that cruelty is acceptable, you might then be able to reduce animal cruelty behaviour in the longer term. So this takes us on to the issue of, well, what are we talking about when we're talking about animal cruelty? And it's actually not as straightforward as we might think. One of the kind of standard quotes is an American quote by Acioni, and he says it's all socially unacceptable behaviour that intentionally causes unnecessary pain, suffering, or distress and or death to an animal. And I think the difficulty with this quote with children is that a lot of their behaviour is not intentional. It might be lashing out behaviour. It might be feeding something poisonous to the dog when they're trying to be kind because it's something they like. So, for example, giving a chocolate bar to their dog. It can be all kinds of behaviours that aren't necessarily intentionally designed to cause harm. So another quote which fits with children a little bit better is the Humane Society of the US quote, where it says that cruelty behaviours that are harmful to animals, from unintentional neglect to intentional killing. And the important thing here is the focus is on the animal's welfare. It's not on the human's intention. It's on the cost to the animal. And I think we need to keep that at the forefront of our minds. Although there hasn't been much research looking at children and animals, and cruelty in particular, it has been highlighted as a really important area of child development for a long time. So Margaret Mead many years ago said one of the most dangerous things that can happen to a child is to kill or torture an animal and to get away with it. It's recognised as being something that's developmentally significant for children. And what we're finding through our research, and Laura will tell you more about this, is it's harmful not just to the animal, but to the child. So the behaviour of being cruel to an animal is harmful to the child as well. It's associated with and predictive of human violence. So there's a link between animal cruelty and all different types of human violence. And there's a graduation hypothesis idea that children who start off being cruel to animals may go on to become cruel to humans as they grow up. I think what we're finding in our research is something a little bit more basic than that, that if children have been exposed to violence or experienced abuse, then they can react by being cruel to animals. It's also associated with and predictive of childhood psychological issues. And in a literature review that we did and published in 2017, we found that of all the studies ever published on psychological factors involved in childhood cruelty, there were only 39 studies ever published, which is a tiny amount. The majority highlighted adverse childhood experiences as being a psychological risk factor. So that's childhood adversity, domestic violence, witnessing abuse, sexual abuse, family kind of functioning issues. They were all highlighted as risk factors. And then we have a range of psychological factors, so behaviour problems, callous unemotional traits, lack of empathy, psychopathy, and different features of personality like callous unemotional traits all seem to be individual risk factors for cruelty. So it's a complex picture with lots of different risk factors. We found it starts young, often in preschool. Estimates of the amount of animal cruelty amongst children varies between 20 and 60%, depending on the study. But there was a kind of a tendency for it to be more common in boys, which is what we see with aggressive behaviour more generally. Just to kind of reiterate some of the psychological factors, behavioural and conduct disorders featured, and these have a range of behavioural issues and cognitive issues around behavioural control and lashing out and impulse control, which might make it very difficult for a child to cope with a situation where an animal isn't doing exactly what they want the animal to do, and the result may be not intentional harm, but lashing out behaviour that harms the animal. Psychopathic, callous unemotional traits and sadistic traits are very rare in children, but they are linked with animal cruelty. And this is where animal cruelty is more likely to be intentional, thought through, acted out. It's also linked with mental health difficulties and developmental disabilities. So if you have a child with a developmental disability, that means they have a kind of slightly more challenges in understanding people's thoughts and emotions. So I'm thinking here about children on the autistic spectrum. Then if they find it challenging understanding human minds, it makes sense that they might have difficulty understanding animal minds and reading animal emotions. So they might not be able to tailor their behaviour towards the needs of the animals, might need a little bit more support. And also, as we've said, trauma, abuse and violence is a key feature, and Laura will talk about that. The last point I really want to make is that when we're talking about children and animals, and this is my son here and our dog Lottie on a hill, I think it's really important to remember that they're not living in isolation. They live in a family and they have friends and they live in a community, and a lot of their knowledge and their behaviour and their attitudes will be a reflection of what they're experiencing around them. So if they see harsh behaviour and they see it as being normal, you know, sort of reprimanding dogs very, very harshly, for example, then they will think that's a normal way to treat an animal. And equally, if you're living in a culture or a community where certain behaviours are normal or engaged in by lots of people, so I'm thinking here cross-nationally about, you know, if you go to places in Colombia or Mexico, dog fighting is not that unusual. There's some communities where it's perfectly normal, and you know, children grow up with this idea that these things are normal. And so when we're thinking about promoting positive behaviour, it's not always starting within the child. The risk factors can be in the child's environment that they're growing up in. So we need to be very mindful of not labelling children and not being kind of too reductionist in how we're thinking about the causes of cruelty, and assuming that they'll always carry on with that behaviour, because cruelty behaviour may just be a reflection of the circumstances they find themselves in. So to try and draw these things to a conclusion, it's really complicated and it's under-researched. We do know that children form really strong bonds with the animals, and this might be especially important now. So if you don't kind of, you know, if you haven't thought about it before, it's a good idea to really think about the impact of COVID on children and pets. Causing harm to an animal doesn't mean a lack of compassion, because harm can be completely unintentional and just needs some support to be remedied. Fostering really positive relationships between children and animals is crucial for all of us, and educational interventions have a real role here to prevent and reduce cruelty. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Jo. That was absolutely fascinating listening to that. Absolutely fascinating. We've got one question of Libby so far, and Libby's saying, also fascinating. Thanks, Jo. Apologies for going slightly off topic, but is there any research into adults' belief in animal minds analogous to that in children?
Yes, there's more research on adults. In fact, this research has primarily been done looking at the extent to which they believe different types of animals have minds. And they found, for example, that there's more of a belief in animal minds when the animal is seen as a companion rather than when it's seen as a food source, for example. And there's a variety of reasons why that might be. It can be quite uncomfortable for us if we're meat eaters to think about an animal that we're going to eat suffering pain and being aware of the circumstances, you know, sort of their, you know, slaughter, if you like. So it makes sense psychologically that we might downplay the animal minds in animals that we use in different ways. And you can see the same with lab animals, for example. So the research started off with looking at adults, and we've kind of adapted it down to think about, well, what might children make of this and how does it develop as children grow up?
That's so fascinating. Lots to think of there. Linda's just saying there's lots of research by Steve Lofnan and others in cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, that's right. He's a social psychologist, and he's done quite a lot of work on meat eating, and exactly that point, how it can be very uncomfortable for us to have a set of beliefs and then behave in a different way. So if we believe that, for example, you know, beef cattle have thoughts, feelings, could live a long time, have a family life, and have all the cognitive capacities that we know they have, then it would be very, very uncomfortable for us to eat them. So we have this kind of cognitive dissonance process where we adjust our beliefs to align with our behaviour.
That's fascinating. Yeah.
He's also in Edinburgh University, just to plug his work.
Oh, fascinating. Thank you so much, Jo. So informative. Rosemary's just asking, are education authorities and government integrating this research into their curriculum, particularly as the curriculum covers early years education and empathy and emotional development?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you very much. It gives us the opportunity to sort of say what we feel about this. A lot of animal welfare organisations and ourselves have all been trying to advocate for animal welfare education to be brought into the school curriculum. In Scotland, it's in biology higher, but only as an option. We've been doing work with different animal welfare organisations to try and get a feel for best practice in animal welfare education, so that then there's a kind of chance to have a bit of a united front so that it could potentially be incorporated in the curriculum. There's a clear kind of link where it should be, but there are some challenges. For example, school teachers aren't taught about animal welfare, so if they were the ones doing the teaching, they'd have to be trained up. And equally, if many animal welfare organisations, and Gilly will tell you much more about this, go into schools to deliver animal welfare education, but it's not necessarily then integrated in what the teachers do with the children the rest of the time. So it's kind of joining those links, but kind of having government interest in pulling these strands together and having a role for it in the curriculum for excellence in Scotland would be wonderful.
Absolutely. Is there anything for everyone watching at home just now? Is there anything that we can do to get that into the curriculum?
The Animal Welfare Education Group, that's one of the aims of it. So Gilly and other organisations that Scottish SPCA has been coordinating a kind of a cross kind of charity forum, really, to push this idea of including animal welfare education in the curriculum. So any support for that, or kind of go through the usual channels that you would go through to try and have your voice heard by MPs, by your local MP.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Thanks so much for that, Jo. I don't know if we've got any more questions. If anyone does have a question for Jo, please put it in the chat anyway, and we can, if we've got time at the end, we can ask Jo then. But thank you so much, Jo. Is there anything else you want to say before we move on?
No, just thanks very much for the opportunity to speak, and I hope it wasn't too technical, if you know what I mean.
Oh, no, absolutely not. It was absolutely fascinating. So many interesting things there that many of us don't even think about. So thank you so much for sharing your presentation today, Jo. Thank you. So next up, we'll hear from Laura Wauthier. Very excited to have Laura here today, alongside Jo and Gilly. So Laura is a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh with a research interest in human-animal interaction. Her thesis focuses on evaluating the Animal Guardians programme delivered by the Scottish SPCA. She completed her BA at Cambridge in zoology and an MSc conversion in psychology at the University of Edinburgh. So I'll hand over to Laura now. Oh, you got a... Mute you.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Let me just quickly share my screen. Share. Hope everyone can see. And let me go to move this. All right, hello everyone. So I thank you very much, Jo, first of all, for kind of setting the scene for me very well. Thank you, Kirsty, for that lovely introduction. So I'll be talking a little bit more about some specific research I've done looking at children's own accounts of animal cruelty. So this is what we call a qualitative study, where we've interviewed the children, and it's much more in depth rather than using lots and lots of children with questionnaires. It used the first batch of children referred to the Animal Guardians program. So without further ado, there we go. So as Jo kind of alluded to, a lot of the research that currently exists in child-animal interaction, which is not that much in the first place, really looks at the positive side of it. And so, for example, this image here is from the National Institute of Health in the USA, and they actually have a specific section that looks at the benefit animals can have for children, and from all sorts of issues, so helping with autism, ADHD, increasing reading confidence, reducing stress, even increasing exercise levels for things like walking dogs. So clearly there's a lot of positive effects that animals can have. But what does that mean for cruelty, and how do we integrate our understanding of cruelty that's happening with all these positive things? And unfortunately, there's really not much of a dialogue between the two literatures. So that's something we're sort of trying to look at. And one of the reasons there's not a lot of dialogue is because of the history of how animal cruelty has been studied. So there's really been 3 strands that have looked at animal cruelty. And the oldest strand is a criminology strand. And this was work by Mead in the 1960s. And it looked at animal cruelty as a predictor of violent behavior, especially delinquency, and at the time, serial killing. So fairly extreme, really, violent behavior, and animal cruelty as an extreme predictor of behavior. And so this gave rise to what we call the MacDonald triad, and it was the idea that animal cruelty, along with 2 other behaviors, fire setting and enuresis, I don't know how to say it, anyway, that predicts serial killing behavior. But unfortunately, as research has continued, the evidence for this has not been so strong, and so it's really been brought into question whether animal cruelty can be seen as part of this triad, and whether it's even really that predictive of very violent behavior. The second strand to come through was the strand of social work, and so this is often referred to as the link. And this is the idea that animal cruelty and animal abuse occurs in an environment of violence and abuse otherwise. So this is kind of the model that they have, where animal abuse, which you see here, is it kind of co-occurs a lot with domestic violence, child maltreatment, and elder abuse. So if you're interested in the link, they have their own website, they have networks of organizations in different countries, and it's really fascinating stuff. So that's kind of come out slightly later. So I think that work was in the 80s mostly that it came out. And then kind of even slightly more recently, there's been a real clinical psychology interest in what animal cruelty means for child development. And Joe touched on a lot of those things, so I won't go into too much detail. But essentially, there's psychological risk factors and behavioral issues that co-occur. So stuff from conduct disorder, which is basically very difficult behavior in a child, to low empathy, personality factors, and also other forms of behaviors like bullying. A lot of studies look at the correlation between animal cruelty and bullying as part of this aggression model. But a lot of this research, if you look at it, really doesn't adopt the child's perspective much. And I think one way you can really see this, that Joe kind of explained quite well, was the definition we take of cruelty. And we have to ask whether it's developmentally appropriate to refer to cruelty when we're talking about children, because is there intentionality? And even when it's a lashing out behavior, is that intentional, or is that because they can't control their emotions and behavior? So I think we have to be a little bit careful, and be careful about using adult terms and adult conceptualizations, which is where this research started, and applying that directly to children. And so that's where the need for adopting the child's perspective comes from. What I do have here is, I think we are establishing fairly clearly that animal cruelty is part of a cycle of violence, but exactly how that happens, we're not entirely sure. And the way I think that works, that's useful to keep in mind as I go through this, is that children who might be exposed to violence from one way or another might observe and learn that aggression and violence is acceptable, that it can also lead to emotional problems, maybe through trauma, but also because maybe they have issues with attachment, and then that will lead to violent behavior, including animal cruelty. So in terms of specific studies, only 2 studies, which is really, really not a lot, only 2 studies have ever interviewed children about animal cruelty. One of them was in 1997 and was not really a psychological study. It was kind of just to lay the groundwork, because it was one of the first studies to do so. And one study was in 2018, and it drew out 3 interesting factors, which is the context around family violence and pet neglect, which I will touch on a bit more, anthropomorphizing animal minds, and motivations around punishment and cruelty. But hopefully I can convince you through this talk that we do have to think about child animal cruelty a bit differently than we think about adult. So, which brings me to the study I will be talking about, which is a qualitative study of children's cruelty to animals. So the purpose of this was to be very child-friendly. All the things you see in this picture here, the toys and all that, that's the stuff I used. It was really meant to be not threatening, very easy for the children to complete. And the interview was divided into 3 sections. So the first section was to get an idea of the child's relationships, both to animals and to people. So for this task, I asked the child to make or draw themselves, because they could choose Play-Doh or drawing, and then anyone important to them around them. And so specifically I said family, friends, or pets. And it was a little bit of an icebreaker to get to know the child, but also the main purpose was to understand how and if children placed animals in their family context. So I'll be talking about that. The second thing we did was look at children's interpretation of ambiguous scenes. So we had 5 images published by Lockwood, and if you're interested in those, I'm happy to give them, or give you the contact details of how you can get them. And so this is an example of one of the pictures. And the final section, oh, sorry, I should say before, the point of this was, one of the theories in the development of aggression is that children interpret scenes negatively, basically, and we wanted to see whether they were doing that also with an animal included in the scene. And finally, we looked at specifically asking children about their cruelty incident, why they were referred. Some of the children were at risk, some of the children had been cruel or even killed an animal. And so for that, we used 3 different things: open questions, so like, why might someone hurt an animal? A vignette, which is a short story. And so the point of this was, we relayed a cruelty incident in the 3rd person so that the child didn't feel like they were being, you know, not attacked, but like that they were being targeted with the questions. It makes it a little bit less difficult for the child to answer if it's like a story about a person. And then finally, we used a cruelty to animals inventory just to kind of ask a few more questions. So the final sample, so as I said, all the children were recruited through the Scottish SPCA. And so this was run literally the first few months the Animal Guardians program was live. In that time, they got 30 referrals and 20 were within the inclusion criteria for the study, which was being within Edinburgh and being the right age range. And we had 16 which were eligible, and finally 10 we received consent for, so that's 62% of the eligible children. And so they were 8.8 years old, but we got from 5 to 11, so the whole age range of primary age children, and we had 9 boys and 1 girl. So that's, you know, again, it's more common in boys, and that definitely bears out in this sample. So this is, so I've divided the results by sections of the interview. So the first one was the child's relationships. And interestingly, something that comes up that's sometimes spoken in research, and I'll be talking about a bit here, is children who hurt animals can sometimes also have really low self-esteem. And 1 or 2 of the children I interviewed had that. So for example, one child had low self-esteem to the point they refused to draw or make themselves, and that's actually this child here. And all the rest of the children did draw or make themselves in some way. And then who did they include? So most of the children included their mom. So 7 of the children did, which is to be expected. Only 2 children included their dad. A lot of times these children were in broken families where the mom and dad were separate for some reason. So that really speaks to the ACEs and all different sorts of stressors these children are exposed to. 4 children included their own pets, and 2 children included an animal of some sort, usually because they didn't have their own pet. So more children, interestingly, were including pets than they were including fathers in these images. And 1 child actually didn't want to include anyone. So again, that speaks to attachment issues, which I'll get back to later. But these are just some examples. So for example, this child, he didn't have pets, but he still wanted to make a tiger. And this was a shark, I think. And this girl, for example, she made her cat and her dog, but didn't make any people in her family. So quite interesting things going on here. I should have said, so I analyzed this data in 2 ways. One was the content analysis, which you can see here. You count up what children do. The other way is a much more in-depth way where you look specifically at the words, and that can give you themes and sort of underlying things that are going on. So this is just quite a striking extract. So this child, who I have called L, drew himself here, and here he says, I'll draw the black eyeballs, the black holes out of my eyes, and for his mouth he says, the black hole of death. So it's quite negative language to be talking about yourself. which is why that was coded as negative description of self. And then he talks about making his mom. So he says, she loves red, so I'm going to draw her evil. And I ask if he likes his mom, and he says, sort of, I kind of hate her, but please don't tell her. So we can see there, again, there's issues with attachment, there's issues with the way children see themselves. And so again, I think this child's quite a typical example of what I was seeing. Issues with relating to themselves, conflicted attachment to his mom, and then he did include his pet cat, his kitten, who he was very close to, and we'll talk a bit about that later. So the results of the image interpretation, again, so this is just 2 examples of them, and we can see they coded outcomes mostly as negative for this one. Now you might say, well, there's something bad that's happened here, but even a slightly more neutral picture, they mostly interpreted it as a negative outcome. And they interpreted human emotions as negative as well. So you can see here, children were mostly interpreting things negatively in these ambiguous pictures, which works with this idea that children who maybe have issues with aggression are actually interpreting situations as bad situations, which, as you can imagine, makes it slightly more likely for them to have a negative response to what's happening. Interestingly, I don't actually have an image of this, but animal emotions were coded equally positively and negatively, or actually no, less. Well, anyways, there was much less coding of negative emotions for animals. So this suggests that actually children saw animals as less negative and less threatening than people, which bore out in some of their, descriptions. So some children actually said, I don't want to do what the humans feel, I want to talk about what the animals are feeling, which is interesting. Again, these are some of the quotes which were kind of useful for including in the more in-depth analysis, because you can't capture this sort of thing just by counting what children are saying. So for example, this child said, that's probably this dead girl, and that might be her dad or something. But why would you interpret this as a dead girl? And this picture, they say, and then something is going to trip over it and they're going to cut their feet on the glass. Again, that's more negative than you would expect from that scene. And for this picture, we see, what do you think is going to happen? Oh, they're going to take the dog to the kennels because he was being bad. So again, that's more negative than you would expect, and that was pretty common for a lot of these children. And then finally, the last section was questions about animal cruelty and their understanding of it. So I actually compared, do they think animal cruelty is similar to a human, or an animal being hurt is similar to a human being hurt? And they all said a human being hurt was a bad thing, and they said it was as bad or worse actually to hurt an animal as a human. And one child struggled to answer the questions, which is why you get this no answer category here. And then, what do you think makes someone wants to hurt an animal? And I think it's quite interesting here, there's quite a mixture of responses, but basically emotional reason, which was lashing out or being mad at it. So again, that's a really interesting one, because what's the intentionality there? They don't necessarily say they want to hurt the animal, but it's because they admit themselves they couldn't control their behavior. 3 children said for punishment, and 1 child said intrinsic to self, but basically the child said it was because he was evil and a thug. So again, it's quite interesting the language these children use about themselves, which is why I included that in the analysis. So the more in-depth analysis, rather than the counting up analysis, came up with 3 themes, which was children were still bonded to animals and saw them generally as positive, even when they were hurting them or cruel to them. These were children in violent environments. So what was interesting, and I think people haven't always highlighted, is that not only did they have exposure to violence, such as domestic violence, but sometimes there was aggressive animal behavior triggering their own behavior towards the animal, such as being bitten was the most common one. So 1 child was bitten by a dog, 1 child was bitten by a hamster, and then the hamster actually was killed. But we have to think, why is that child in a situation where the animal is being aggressive to them? And potentially there's an issue there around they're not being supervised enough around animals. Something to bear in mind. And then finally, signs of emotional issues and trauma. So this is a slightly more complex one. There's quite a lot going on. But again, poor attachment to family members really came up a lot. Negative view of self, low self-esteem, and sometimes, and I have a quote to show this, the cruelty event itself could be traumatic for the child. And so I think that's also important to bear in mind when we are addressing and doing interventions for animal cruelty. Okay, so these are just some quotes just to kind of illustrate these themes and bring them to life a little bit. So the emotional bonding to animals. So this was a child who made himself in fuzzy felts in the middle. And this is actually me, the interviewer, He didn't want to make anyone in his family, but he said, oh, I'll make you. I was like, all right, if you want. And then the child, this is their dog. So basically within his family, he only included his dog. And he said, so he said, I said, who do you want to put inside your circle? And he said, so he gave his dog a nickname throughout the whole interview. He called it Dumb Dog. And he said, he gave a lot of stories about him playing with his dog. So one of them was, when it was a puppy, I had to teach it how to go up and down the stairs. And when I went up to get my covers, and then he had a story about how the dog took the covers and all that. The next big theme was the normalization of violence. And so this one, I picked this one because it really illustrates how the child hurting the animal is linked into what they observe around them and to their emotional issues. So this boy said, I have to hit the cat because he's being bad, but I wish I had brought my cat even worse. And I say, why? And he says, because I mean, like, even when we're sleeping, I never slap him, actually, it's my mom who slaps him. So that speaks to him observing that violent behavior from his mom. And so I ask, oh, so your mom slaps him? And he says, I just slap him when he's being like too good to fight her and charge at her. So again, this child's relationship with his cat is almost a way to get at his mom. It was quite a complex case, but I think it just illustrates how these children are seeing violent behavior and how it's really integrated in their family life sometimes in a way that's quite complex. And finally, this is the one where the child seemed to have an element of trauma around his own cruelty incident. So this boy had killed kittens, and this was the story he gave about what happened when I asked him. It's a little bit confused, but basically you can see he's transforming it. And this boy was quite young, so he said the kitten still lived. Its leg, they gave it some medicine to make it go to sleep. Then they cut its leg open because it was broken, and they took its bone out, and they took the bone of a bird and gave it the right size and put it back in the leg, and they tied it up. So, which is quite a graphic thing for a young boy to be saying. So anyway, I think I use that to illustrate kind of the impact the cruelty incident can have on the child. But also this boy, so the kitten died in real life, but obviously he made a story where the kitten didn't die, and I think that speaks to how careful we have to be when we speak to these children about what happened. So to kind of conclude and bring everything together, I think what this research shows is there is indeed this cycle of violence that these children are caught up in. And the animals are caught up in it as well. And it's not so much that the child wants to hurt the animals, it's that the animals are caught in this web of violence and they just get caught up in it. But a lot of the times, at least the children I interviewed, it wasn't so much that they wanted to hurt the animals, it's that the animals were kind of there. So the key points from the research, I think, to take home and kind of condense it, was first of all that animals can be important attachment figures even in cases of cruelty. So we have to be, so this is like suggestions, what I think that means. So we shouldn't assume that children don't like animals, and we should evaluate for attachment, especially as Jo mentioned, a lot of these kids can struggle making attachment to people. So we have to be careful if we think about removing an animal, just to think about whether the child is attached to that animal before we remove the animal. We also have to look at the role of family and siblings in causing harm. So I gave an example where a child saw his mom hitting a cat, but there was a couple examples where children actually spoke about siblings harming animals, and that's kind of how the situation escalated. So it's important to think about siblings as well and not just parents. And if possible, I think the point here is to evaluate the family situation rather than just the child. Again, as Jo said, it's not just the child, it's the child's context that's causing this. And finally, real issues around regulating emotions and behaviors, which seemed in most cases to be what led to animal aggression towards a child or the child's aggression towards the animal. So I think interventions should think about, you know, can we help children regulate their emotions, behavior? Can we help them practice positive behaviors and kind of more calm behavior around animals so that this sort of thing doesn't happen? Which brings me on to the research I'm doing now. So this is really very much in progress, but a lot of these concepts that came up in this qualitative interview, we're really interested in following up in. So we're really looking at attachment in depth, which is this little Playmobil house. I'm using that as part of my procedure to look at children's way of interacting with their family in a bit more depth. Empathy, so I've come up with these drawings on looking at how children interpret scenes and looking more a little bit at the way they empathize with what's going on, both the animal and the person involved. And finally, something called executive functioning, which is the child's ability to inhibit their behavior and follow rules. And we want to look at whether children who are cruel to animals, are they actually struggling with that more than control children? And we're, of course, using questionnaires to look at knowledge and beliefs and attitudes. I think my take-home message for this is that it's really complex, and yes, there's a cycle of violence going on with these children that we have to be mindful of, but it's a bit more than that. I think we have to think about attachment, and we have to think about how the animals play an active role in that as well. So that's it. Any questions for me now? And that's my dog, who always, her only question is, do you have treats? So.
Amazing. Wow, thank you, Laura. That was so informative and really, really interesting research that you've done there. We've got one question from Libby so far again, and Libby's asking, is there any comparable information about interpretation of images among children who have not been identified as wanting to hurt animals?
So that's a very good question. No, basically not a published research. And unfortunately for this study that I did, I didn't have a control group. But I am taking that forward now, and the pictures I showed there at the end that I had drawn, so great artistic skills. That group of children that I've interviewed, there is a control group there and a referred group. So hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit more about that, because as you maybe saw, some of the pictures are inherently a little bit negative. So it's a little bit hard to draw conclusions, you're right, without a control group.
That's so interesting. If anyone else has any more questions for Laura, please put them in the chat and we can ask her them. Laura, did you, so the children that you were interviewing, was that like specifically children who have all abused animals or seriously abused animals?
So we had actually a mixture. So 2 of them had killed, 4 of them had harmed but not killed. Yeah, that's right. And 4 of them were at risk but had not harmed. And so Gilly will be speaking a lot more about how referrals for animal guardians worked, and basically I just took any referral who came in. But because parents can refer and teachers can refer, there's anything from we're super concerned because something has happened to I'd rather act now before something happens. I actually did an analysis. So all this, by the way, is literally about to be published and I cannot link you to the publication yet because it's not quite out yet. But in that paper, I have a little bit more analysis on that. And so I did a preliminary kind of analysis on the children who were cruel, so either severe or moderate harm, to the children who hadn't harmed. And I looked at whether their interpretations of the scenes differed. And basically the children who had actually harmed were slightly more negatively interpreting the scenes than the children who were only at risk of harming. But because my whole sample is only 10, and that was a sample of 6 and 4, it's not a significant difference, but the means are different. So, and they are in the way you would expect from what we call social information processing theory, i.e. the more serious behavior suggests there's more serious negative interpretation, if that makes sense.
So fascinating. Can't wait to read your paper when you publish it, Laura. That's such an interesting topic. Joe Goodman says, this is heartbreaking, those poor children. What are the outcomes for them? If they have committed such awful acts of cruelty, can that cycle be broken?
Well, I think that's very much an ongoing question. I think we all hope that it can be. I think the first step is definitely an intervention to look at the child's behavior and talk to them about it. Again, not in an accusatory fashion, because especially historically, I think, oh, children who are animals, they kind of demonized is a strong word, but they're very like seen as negative. Oh, right, that child's got issues. I think we have to be very careful not to do that. I also think that historically, again, if ever a child was referred to adolescent and mental health services, they're not usually, the person maybe who's doing their treatment won't know about the cruelty, and so that won't be specifically addressed. So it's very important that even if they're going to see mental health services, they also have an intervention specifically addressing the harm. And I think that's kind of one of the things Animal Guardians is trying to provide. So yes, I think hopefully we can do something about it. And the first step is to have a good intervention to help them, basically.
Absolutely, thank you.
Quick point to add, if you're interested in more in-depth information about interventions, there is a book published called The Any Care Child Approach. which you can look up, but you can also email me if you want to know more.
Okay, thank you, Laura. I think we'll just take one more question. I know we've got another one, but we might leave that for the end if we've just got a bit of time. So from Rebecca, Laura, can I ask whether there's any sense that these children were ever afraid to express compassion for animals in their home or community environments, whether the compassion would have been viewed negatively?
Right, that's an interesting question. So I didn't specifically ask the children about that. I didn't have a specific question targeting it. So my answer is very limited and circumspect. There was one child who made an interesting comment on having a bad brother who had killed some fish, and so the brother was kicked out of the house. And so there was a sense, I think there's a sense for some of these children that this behavior, if not expected of them, is certainly a norm. And so you think, well, if ever they want to show they're tough and they have a tough brother, is that how the only thing they can think to do? I guess it's hard to say whether, it's hard to answer that question specifically though, whether they would be afraid to show compassion. I think that really depends on the specific person they're talking to, I imagine. So if you're creating an environment for them, that's okay. Children usually pick up on that pretty quickly. But in their family environment, which I obviously have no idea of, that might not be the case.
It's really interesting. Thank you, Laura. And Rosemary, if we've got time at the end, we'll answer your question as well. But thank you so much for your presentation today. Your research is absolutely fascinating. What an interesting work that you're doing, and wish you all the best with that in the future, Laura. Thank you for speaking.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we'll move on to Gilly, and just give you a brief introduction on who Gilly is. Gilly is the Head of Education, Policy and Research at the Scottish SPCA. After completing her Bachelor of Science Honours Zoology degree at the University of Aberdeen, she pursued her interest in primatology and went on to complete a Master of Science by Research degree focusing on captive primate welfare and behaviour at the University of Edinburgh. Very excited to talk to Gilly today. So I'll just hand over to her just now, and the same again, if you've got any questions, we'll just answer them at the end of Gilly's presentation. Thank you. Gilly there? Oh, I think we might have lost her. Oh, I think she might be experiencing some connection issues just now. So what we'll do is, I think we'll go back to the questions that we had for Jo, and then if that's okay, Jo, with you, and we can answer some of these while we're waiting for Gilly. Has anyone heard from her? No, okay. Hopefully it's nothing serious. So for Jo then, oh, thank you to who's going to message Gilly, that's appreciated. So Jo, this is from another Jo, and she's asking, I would be interested in knowing your stance on pets in the classroom. If this improves empathy for animals, or since classroom pets are frequently poorly kept, could this perpetuate unintentional neglect? Oh, mute your mic. It's annoying how it does that. Can you speak now, Jo?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Thanks for the question. There's quite a complex answer to this, because on the one hand, I'm involved in research on reading with dogs, where dogs are taken into a classroom, obviously not at the moment. And you can see big benefits to children of that. On the other hand, though, there's real welfare concern about the animals. And there's a lot of bad practice from an animal welfare perspective, which also then might translate to risks to the children in the schools. So I'm aware that there have been bites in school contexts where teachers have taken a dog in for the benefit of the children's learning, but actually the dog has not been kind of well suited to that environment, and probably become quite stressed as a result. So I think if we can use alternatives to animals, that's a really advantageous thing to do. So Gilly and I and others have been working on, robotic animals and things like that, to see whether there's some animal simulants that have the same or similar benefits. But if animals are going to be used, then I think we really need very, very clear welfare guidelines to make sure that the practice isn't just good for children, it's good for the animals as well.
Thank you for sharing that, Jo. It's really, really interesting. Hope that answered your question. Hello, Jo. And I think Gilly's back now. Gilly, are you there?
Yep, I am. Typical. I thought the internet would just crash exactly when it's almost time for me to speak. You just have to love Zoom.
Okay.
Thank you so much for having me. It's amazing. Scottish SPCA and OneKind often work together on many things, and it's just fantastic to have the opportunity to share what you're doing at the moment. And likewise with Jo and Laura. Jo and I have been working together for over a decade now, which I can't believe. And obviously Laura's our amazing PhD student who's been working with us on our master projects, and then she's now moved on to her PhD as well. So I will just share my screen. There we go. So what I really wanted to do is kind of bring it into context on how the Scottish SPCA really values the research behind what we want to do, and obviously our mission to have compassionate, empathetic animals and take care of each other as well. We're very fortunate to have such a strong relationship with the University of Edinburgh, and myself, I've been with the organisation now for 15 years, and certainly with the education, it's been so crucial that everything we do has a meaningful impact. At the end of the day, we are a charity. We need to use our resources to the best effect. We have a fantastic large education team who gives us the opportunity to actually reach every part of Scotland, which is amazing to have that resource out there. And as I say, we do operate throughout every part of Scotland. We are different to our friends, the RSPCA. I see that Dave's actually part of this, who's my equivalent with the RSPCA, who's checked in as well today. And it's fantastic because RSPCA, they do fantastic work in England and Wales, and obviously we focus on the Scottish side. I think Dave's actually already posted up a link to do with a petition that has been looking at how to get animal welfare education included in the curriculum. And there is an Animal Welfare Education Alliance, which we actually had a meeting on Monday, because it's important that together we work together closely as a sector and we learn from each other, and we're trying to deliver the best animal welfare education that we can. We do have a Scottish group, and that involves anyone who does deliver animal welfare education in Scotland, including like your Cats Protection, Dogs Trust and so on. And we're just about to embark on this massive brand new grand plan just before we went into lockdown, so we're going to have to pick that up a little bit later. But that's the important thing, is that we all work in partnership to get the best outcomes for everyone. So when it comes to how the Scottish SPCA gets involved with both the people and the animal side, there are lots of examples throughout Scotland of where the human-animal bond works really well. So our education programme as a whole focuses across all generations, whether that's from nursery age all the way up to older adults as well. And as Jo and Laura covered, animals can be really a positive experience. They can offer a bit of solace, they can support when maybe someone's feeling quite isolated or quite lonely, particularly in the sort of older adult generation. They can get you out to do exercise. They can be quite good, say if you've got a dog and you get all the family out the house to walk the dog, you actually get a bit of more communication with your children because they're not fixed to a screen or a mobile phone, and you actually get to find out a little bit more about them. So it's an easy way to try and incorporate animals into your life, particularly even when it comes to wildlife, and you can go and get that breathing space and enjoy nature. And you see that as you engage with children throughout schools and through different developmental stages, their experience with animals changes. So when they're very young, they're talking about maybe a pet hamster, a pet rabbit that they might get to cuddle, or they maybe get to have a little bit of playtime with it. When they get a bit older, they sometimes say that, oh, I'm getting a bit more responsibility. It's my job to go and feed them, or it's my job to let them out in the morning or to clean out. And then when it goes into adolescence, there's lots of work that certainly Jo's been looking at as well, to do with what are their views when it comes to animals. are animals a source of comfort at that time when things are really challenging, maybe around your world? You're trying to make these tough decisions on what you're going to do with your life. You maybe not getting on with your peers at school. Are the animals there? Someone who's going to listen and not judge? And then, as I say, as you get into the sort of working world, everything's a bit hectic. Sometimes the animal gives that opportunity to just get away from it all. So they can do lots of positives for us. And again, as Jo and Laura have covered, there are lots of reasons why sometimes that bond will break, and it various environmental things. It could be financial problems. Are people having difficulties? They might have to actually sell their house. Can the animal go with them? There's obviously the link with domestic violence situations, and we know that people who are caught in that, often they will not leave that home because they don't want to leave the animal behind. They can't take the animal with them into a shelter or what have you. So what do? They're kind of stuck. There's people who suffered bereavement and maybe they just need to go on to another part of their life. They can't take the animal with them. We know as well that having new children in the house, a new baby, sometimes that added challenge can affect, maybe if there's only been an animal there before and they've had the first child, that can affect that relationship and the time that they have towards that animal. And then of course, Sally, you've got things like drugs, alcohol, divorce, separation. All these can have an impact on any animal, any child living in that environment. Now, when we started doing Animal Guardians, we started this very much from looking at, okay, what can we do to support an animal that maybe is getting harmed by a child, intentionally, unintentionally? What's going on in that child's life? What agencies do we maybe need to spend more time chatting to? So we actually initially started up an advisory panel before we went live with this program, and on that advisory panel we have people from the CAMS team, so Child Adolescent Mental Health Services. We've got social workers, we've got Police Scotland on there, we've got Scottish Fire and Rescue Service on there, we've got other organisations such as Edinburgh Women's Aid, and we were very lucky to have support from the Irish McDonald Charitable Trust to actually get this programme really established. That advisory group has been so key to the success of Animal Guardians and where it's got to, because it's given us an option of saying, okay, what should the consent process be like? Who should we be getting consent from? Yes, we know we need to get it from child, parent. Okay, what if they don't live with their parents? Who else is in that network? We need to make sure it is on board with supporting a child being part of a more targeted programme. We need to make sure that we're getting a teacher's perspective. For example, how is that going to fit in from us actually delivering the programme? A key thing with Animal Guardians, so obviously I'm in uniform, I spend a lot of my time in uniform, but Animal Guardians, we do not wear uniform when we are running and delivering this programme. We don't have a logoed vehicle that turns up at the school because we're very conscious that some of these children are already being stigmatised for different things as it is, and the last thing they need to have is sit in a nurture room or in a corridor with someone who looks like a police officer with logoed bags and other children walking by going, oh, I wonder what they've done now, you know. So we were very mindful of that to make sure that it's as discreet as possible. We would never go to a child's house or family space. If they are not attending school, then we will tend to go to somewhere like Barnardo, Scotland, their family rooms, or somewhere else where that child is familiar with and where they feel safe. And we've got two fantastic youth engagement officers, Susan and Karen. So Karen looks after the West and Susan looks after the East. And together as a team, we've really worked hard to try and develop a programme that is fun, that it's engaging. It's nowhere by means sort of targeting or threatening. We even tried to make sure we change the language as to how we market this programme to teachers. So we've used a lot of words like nurturing, and try to avoid actually saying cruelty as a word, and more along, okay, are they having a negative interaction with an animal? Are they maybe too rough with that animal, or have they actually seriously harmed the animal? Animals required vet treatment, or worse. And it's been interesting, we've seen a range of children who have been referred to the Animal Guardians programme. We're now over 120 referrals since it started, and a very broad age range. When we first launched this programme, we thought, okay, research tells us cruelty peaks around 6 years of age and again in adolescence, so we'll probably get that age range, but we've sadly had a few 4-year-olds, which is not what we were expecting. So we've had to be prepared to make sure we can adapt the materials for that broad age range. And we have very much focused on primary age children just now, And we're currently in the process of working on a suitable program for adolescents, because an adolescent is not going to want to sit and throw dice with you which have different pictures of animals on it and emotions. So we need to find a different way to engage. When someone inquires about animal guardians, we very much make sure we have a proper phone conversation with them. We find out, okay, what's going on in that child's life, try and get a bit of information. If it's from another agency, that can be quite challenging, because an agency as well is trying to gauge that trust with us, so they don't always disclose as much information as you would like at the start. As the process goes on, they then tell you things and you think, oh, I wish I'd known that like 4 weeks ago, and then it would have actually helped me. But you can also sympathize with them, because we are not a human charity, we are an animal welfare charity. So it's a different way of trying to get different agencies who have human focus to respect that and understand why we're doing what we're doing. We make it very clear that there is a research element to this, and it's important that we learn as we go along to make sure the program's the best it can be. Not all parents and guardians will sign up for research, and again, it's because of that stigma around how animal cruelty can be perceived. So we'll launch it, we'll reach out with the Animal Guardians program, they'll go on to Google, read about Jamie Polder, they'll read about all these other cases, and they're like, no, I don't want my child to be that, because I don't want it stigmatized. And that can be quite hard to try and turn someone around from that, but it doesn't prevent that child from being obviously part of the program. So that's where Laura will get some children who have signed up to research, and others who will just continue with the program, but they're not included in that sort of data set. The program itself normally takes kind of 3 phases. So we will always tend to start off with looking at animal emotions and recognition of that. But we also bring into human emotions as well, because if a child struggles to recognize human emotions, they're going to struggle even more to recognize animal emotions. And we'll do different games where they just maybe look at pictures, or they roll, we've got 2 dice. One dice has pictures of all human faces on it, and one has different animals, and they roll it together, and they have to think about, okay, you've got a human who's crying, and then you've rolled, the other dice has got a picture of a deer on it. When do you think a deer might feel really sad? Can you give me an example of when you might think that might happen? That's a really good indication as how they kind of perceive different animals. And we particularly have included all animals, so farming, wildlife and pets, to make sure, because you do see differences, and we see it in the classroom as well, of how children interpret what they think about animals. Particularly, they have less knowledge on farming and farm animals in general. They only have knowledge on wild animals that they have seen, that they've physically seen, and don't really have that concept. But they have a bit more familiarity, obviously, when it comes to pets. We then would go into a bit more detail on needs. Okay, what do animals need to keep them healthy, keep them happy, keep them safe? And that touches on a little bit to do with, obviously, what their needs are. And sometimes, again, you get information disclosed to you of, I had one where he's like, oh no, I just sleep in mummy's bed. And I'm thinking, okay, you're 8, 9 years old, why are you still sleeping in mummy's bed? So there's things like that. And obviously, again, we are not the social worker or the psychologist or anything, and we make it very clear to the child, if you tell me something that makes me worry about you and your safety, then I might need to go and tell they are close to, and we would go and report that as a concern. And then the last part of the kind of program is looking at responsibilities. So what can they do if they're in different situations? How can they interpret that? What could their actions be? We've got a lovely story called Lucky Max, which is a boy's journey to getting his dog, and he learns through different things that you have to do before you get an animal. And that's a really good way of just looking, okay, have they learned that animals have feelings? If so, have they learned that they have needs? Okay, if they can understand that and they accept that, can they now use that information to put that into a real world context of, you found that, or you see that, what do you actually do? What we are now developing with Laura is, again, a little bit more work on looking at response to those aggressive outbursts, that frustrations which are out with their control, but the animal's there and I can't stop myself. So how else can we build that into the program? Again, not as a psychologist or but as an educator, are there other things that we can actually do to help support that? So that's kind of where we're at the moment. Obviously, in the current climate, we've not been able to do the physical Animal Guardians program just now, so we're moving to digital. We have had some referrals in over the last couple of weeks, so we are working on different resources with those children until we can get a bit more up and running. But it's so important for us that other agencies recognise that this service is an offer. And we went to, actually all three of us, Susan, Karen and myself, were at a conference not that long ago. And I think we all had the same conversations about 20 times over with social workers and teachers, and they're telling us these stories, and they're like, oh, so yeah, my child, I've seen them and they keep putting the cat in the washing machine, but didn't know what to do about it. And have you reported it? No, because I didn't know who to report it to. And then when you have that conversation, like, right, okay, and they walk away and they're like, oh, there's actually someone who can help me. And just looking at ways to get that message out. We know through all the kind of education work that we have been doing, so we've been in schools for a number of years now, and we've had to evolve how we deliver education. And again, that's been based on a lot of the research. We're now in the robotics world as of last year. And again, we're trying to keep up with the times and making sure that when you're in a classroom, kids actually want to engage with what you're offering, and it makes it a memorable experience. We're very fortunate because we have a large team that we can speak to over 210,000 kids a year, if not more. And again, as I say, we'll focus on lots of different age ranges. You'll see some of these kids have got little rabbits, and this was a study that we did, got to be the year before last now, I think, Jo, where we took some mechanical rabbits, and then we took some fluffy rabbits, and then there was a group which didn't have any rabbits at all. And we just looked at how children interact with each of those. Does it make a difference if the rabbit can move to what they learn? And we found that actually, yes, it did. And Jo and I were just looking at getting a paper out on this, hopefully very soon. And that was really good because it gave us, again, another steer of, okay, what can we do to make it more informative for primary 1 to 3 pupils? Because at the moment we'll go in, we'll do an assembly. They might remember that you're the animal lady, that you look a bit like a police officer, that they do need to tell someone if an animal's hurt, and that's probably about where you're going to go with them at that age. So now we get a chance to actually deliver sets into the schools. So when we're with the older kids doing our robotic workshops, these kids get a chance to dress up as vets and as a Scottish SPCA inspector. They have different activities that they work through with their teachers as well. So we start off with rabbits. This year it's hamsters, is what we've been doing. And we've been trying to go through like common animals that kids have. And the hamster is a really good one because the hamster is actually on wheels and it can go quite fast across the classroom floor. And again, you're trying to get that message across, okay, don't just all land on top of it and squash it. And so it's a fantastic way of getting them to engage with something. We've also done this at various kind of science events and so on as a different way of teaching sort of empathy and compassion and animal welfare. And with the older ones, we have a partnership with OneKind, and this is getting children to actually build an animal style robot, so to speak, with the blocks that they've created. And then they get to do a bit of coding. So we will give a scenario and we'll ask them to code the animal to respond to that. So we might say, okay, you've come across this rabbit, you're going towards it. What do you think the rabbit's going to do? Is it going to turn away and go under the table? Is it going to make a noise? And same with like a cat, and we've got different mascots. And that's been working really, really well. And again, it's made us a bit more modern and current and think, oh, yeah, you were here last year, but now you brought something else that's new and exciting. And that's probably the challenge, I would say, with animal welfare education, is constantly having to reinvent yourself and try and stay up to date with the interests and the tech and everything to make sure that you're still engaging and you're still memorable. We have evaluated our program a few years ago now, and we've shown that it increases knowledge about needs and obviously recognition about the Scottish SPCA and what we do. And I think out of all of this, and probably my take-home messages, obviously Laura and Jo have said, when a child harms an animal, you know, there's so many other factors. They're not the bad child, the demon child, which sometimes people refer them as. That's not at all. And taking that time, and something we've seen is obviously, again, children who maybe are struggling in like a foster care environment, for example, we get more inquiries now to do with that, to try and keep those relationships going and keep them in that environment as long as possible. We do know that previous history shows that if a child has animal cruelty on their record, the chance of them getting fostered declines dramatically. So that's potentially why animal cruelty is kind of underreported and not addressed through other means. So it's important that no matter whether you work with humans, whether you work with animals, and particularly from a child level, that everyone can communicate with each other and recognizes that there could be a child and an animal in the center of that who needs support. And you can get that support and you'd be more effective if you actually work together. And that's something that we're going to do another push on it actually next week, to do with that multi-agency approach and have that recognition of what each other does and who you interact with on a day-to-day basis, and how can you share that information and how can you get the best possible outcomes for all concerned. We work with so many different partners. I could put on as many as I could fit on the screen, but it just kind of really emphasizes, even just we are a reporting agent, so we will take things to the Procurator Fiscal Service and they will take cases through for us, but that's always a last resort. So prosecution for the Scottish SPCA will be always a last resort. We will always want to try and do our best to keep a person and the animal together. If that's not possible, at least safeguard the welfare of the animal, and try and do further education. We're doing a lot more work, again, from how we can educate adults, because as we've discussed today, it's that learned behaviour in the home. And again, with animal guardians, we're trying to do more of an aftercare package. So a child's been through the animal guardians programme, they've maybe actually, if they've done really well, they've come out to one of our animal rescue rehoming centres with their parent carer, and they've got a chance to see our work at life, and maybe bond a little bit with the animals that are there, because sometimes those animals have not had a good experience either. That's why they're with us, and they're feeling a bit lonely, they're feeling a bit isolated. So it's important that we continue working with lots of other organisations to spread that message. Even like we've started working with the Armed Forces charities to do with, again, link between mental health, and sometimes they go through difficult times and they're having to actually part with the animal. Is there something else that we can do together to try and keep that bond there? RSABI, again, they support the agricultural industry. So again, if they're supporting a farmer on an emotional well-being side and helping with the finances, we can be there to support the welfare side. And okay, maybe should we try and help you sell some of your stock, but keep some so you've still got a small holding, so you've still got the lifestyle that you're familiar with. So there's so many things, and I think as an animal welfare organisation, it's important that we as a sector work together and we stick together and we help each other, because you're definitely going to have a much better outcome by sharing your expertise. So I think that's probably all I want to say at the moment, and we'll just see if anyone's got any questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Gilly. That was so informative. Just like the other presentations, so fascinating, and it's so great to hear in such great detail the work that you're doing. It's so interesting. You know, personally, it's not even something that I would even think about, is that these children, you know, there's so many external factors affecting them, and that we need to change our perceptions that, you know, they're not bad children. There's just so many things that they're going through. So thank you so much to all of you for all the work that you're doing on this. It's amazing, absolutely amazing. I don't think we have any questions for you yet, Gilly, but I'm sure we will do. So for now, I'll just go back to Rosemary's question that I think was for Laura. And Rosemary asked, has any research been done on the childhood experiences of adults who participate in blood sports and adults who work in slaughterhouses? So anyone feel free to answer that one. Oh, you're muted. Try that now, Laura. I think that should.
Yeah. So I actually don't really know anything about that. Certainly not my research hasn't looked at that. So is that, can you just ask a question? Oh, Joe wants to say something.
Oh, I don't know why it keeps turning your microphones off. Sorry, bear with me. Here we go, Joe. I think you should be able to.
Okay. There has been some work on young people working in slaughterhouses, suggesting that that process is really desensitizing, so that they become much more used to and tolerant of you know, sort of very difficult circumstances for animals. And that some qualitative work has shown that that desensitization has tended to make their behavior much rougher with the animals at, you know, sort of in the slaughterhouse context. So that's the only work I know about slaughterhouses, but suggesting it's not necessarily that you're interested in being kind of harmful to animals when you go into that job, but the process of that job can make you be quite kind of rough with animals as a result of becoming desensitized to it.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting. Thank you, Joe, for sharing that. We've got a question for you, Gilly, now of Leanne, and Leanne's asking, have you had any referrals to animal guardians from children involved in a domestic violence setting? How does the Scottish SPCA help animals and children in this situation?
Yeah, so actually one of the sort of children that Laura was actually speaking to, he has or was from a domestic violence setting, and that was clear to do with how he's actually interpreting his relationship with his mum and the cats, and how he's almost mimicking between his cat and his mum's cat to do with what he had observed. When it comes to domestic violence, it's something that Scottish SSPCA years ago, we were involved in the First Strike campaign, which Libby will also was very involved in that at the time. And again, we are actually looking to push more of that messaging in the coming weeks, because obviously in the current climate just now, from speaking to Police Scotland and speaking to Women's Aid and so on, as lockdown eases and people are able to actually get out and communicate more and maybe touch base with people that they haven't seen, there is an expectation that reports of domestic violence might actually increase. Always with our point of view, we work very closely with Police Scotland on a daily basis on a variety of different jobs, and that is the same case when it comes to domestic violence, that we will help deal with the animal side, they will deal with the human side. And if a child's involved, then obviously we can put in the direction of Animal Guardians programme and support that way as well.
Thank you, that's really interesting, Gilly. You've also just got another wee comment off Libby there saying, great messages from you all, thank you. I was thinking about Joe's comment on the need to protect animals used in programmes and interactions, etc. It would be great to see this developed, as when I speak to accommodated children, they regularly say that their favourite thing in the foster placement is the family pet. Is there any progress in that direction?
There's a kind of challenging kind of issue around children in foster care are often the ones who can be kind of rough in their handling and cruel to animals. But at the same time, there's growing evidence that pets for these children can be really crucial in forming bridges to secure relationships with other humans, because they've often come from a background where their human attachment systems have been really badly disrupted. There's not that much research with looked after and accommodated children around, sort of their attachment to pets. They tend to, the research that's been done so far has been tending to focus on the cruelty incidents that occur. But there is the work that's going on from the kind of Care Commission, the Animal Magic issue, where they're encouraging residential care settings and nurseries to get animals to kind of try and be a positive influence on children and the elderly. The only problem has been that they haven't added in an animal welfare dimension to that. So Gilly and I and others have all been kind of meeting regularly to try and add an animal welfare dimension to the Animal Magic guidelines, which have been widely encouraging care homes, residential care settings for children and nurseries to get pets.
And I'll just add to that, so with that group that we've established, it's involving obviously the Care Inspectorate, Education Scotland, also SCAS, Society for Companion Animal Studies, are part of that as well. They've done a lot of work with the prisons, for example. And again, actually, before we kind of went into lockdown, we did a lot of messaging with those specific groups to kind of say, if you are struggling, because you've already invested on having animals on site, and you are now going to have to cope with lots of other things, do you need our support? Do we need to come in and help and offer advice and guidance? But the purpose of that group really is to pull together some strong protocols to make sure that the welfare of the animals is safeguarded as well. Sometimes, particularly, we've had instances where we've actually had to remove animals from nurseries because the welfare has not been there, and they've gone out on a whim and thought, I'll just get this, and not really kind of thought about it. So that's the whole purpose of that group, is to really establish guidance across all the different sectors where you might see animals cropping up, and make sure that that experience is positive for both the people involved and the animals as well.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing. That's really interesting. I think we've probably just got time for one more question of Eve, and Eve is asking for Joe, is there a pattern between the type of abuse experienced by a child and the cruelty they inflict upon animals, i.e. child neglect causing a child to neglect an animal?
We haven't gone in enough detail yet, and this isn't just our team, but internationally the research hasn't really drilled down into enough detail. I think it's more that any form of child abuse will lead to trauma, and the traumatic reaction may be a risk factor for children lashing out with animals. If you think about social kind of learning theory and modelling, you might predict that children would behave with the animal in a way that they've experienced behaviour. So you could kind of hypothesize that physical abuse may play itself out with physical harm to animals, but nobody's actually done enough research in enough detail to really figure that all out yet, because as Laura said, there's only ever been 2 previously published studies on children who've talked about their own cruelty, and our study is going to be coming out soon. That will make 3 in the world ever published, talking to children about their cruelty. But I think that's something we do need to look at very closely.
Wow.
There is a newly established project by One Welfare, and it's called the One Welfare Phoenix Project, and that's starting to take a little bit more of a global view and using the expertise and the research obviously that Joe and everyone is doing to look at, okay, you can do research in different contexts, but you also have that cultural difference, as Joe mentioned at the very, very start. So you have to be careful when it comes to your interpretation as well. So that project is very much in the early stages just now, but it's hoped that that might start getting a bit more of a global view and sharing of knowledge and expertise. And hopefully we can all start filling the different gaps in research that's sort of at present at the moment. So